Hello and welcome back to OLLI's 2024 at the U Speaker Series. I'm Laura Peterson. This At the U series comes to you from the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at the University of Minnesota. OLLI is a learning community for people 50 and over who are curious, lifelong learners. We offer hundreds of non-credit courses a year, plus other ways to get involved, like special interest groups and volunteer opportunities. I would also like to extend a warm welcome to our OLLI members who are on this webinar, as well as our guests. And a thank you to our sponsors, AARP Minnesota and the University of Minnesota Alumni Association. We acknowledge that the University of Minnesota Twin Cities is built within the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. It is important to acknowledge the peoples on whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with our tribal nations. Today's presentation is titled Awesome Apples, Honeycrisps to Kudos. Our guest speaker is Dr. James Luby. Dr. Luby is a professor in the Horticultural Sciences department, and he directs research in fruit crops, breeding, and genetics, developing new varieties of apples, wine grapes, blueberries, strawberries, and other fruits. Dr. Luby, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Laura, and thank you to everybody who's joining in today. Please excuse my voice a little bit. I was visiting my toddler grandson over the weekend, and he shared his cold with me, so I may be a little irregular at times here. But what I'd like to do today, although I've been involved in breeding a number of different fruit crops over the years, is talk about our apple breeding program at the University of Minnesota, especially. And of course, this is a very well-known and kind of iconic program here in Minnesota. And hopefully you can see my screen now.
Yes, it looks good.
Very good. Okay, thank you, Laura. Yeah. And the title was suggested to me by one of your members, Honeycrisp, which was sort of the first famous variety when at least that I've been involved with here from the University of Minnesota, to Kudos, which is our newest one. And I would be remiss not to mention my colleague, David Bedford. David and I have been breeding apples and other fruits for over 40 years here at the university. And he has certainly played a key role in the introduction of all of our apple varieties that have come from the university in recent years. Let's see. Why is this not advancing? There we go. Okay. So what I'd like to talk about today will be kind of the origins of the University of Minnesota apple breeding program and how we develop new varieties in our program. And then a little more about Honeycrisp, because Honeycrisp really changed the game for not only us, but for apple breeding programs around the world. And then a little bit about the legacy of Honeycrisp. Honeycrisp has become one of the most popular apples and is becoming a widely used parent in breeding programs. So first of all, I mentioned, since I did mention it before, Kudos is our newest apple variety from our program, and you probably won't see any trees of it until about 2025, I would guess. But at that point, it should start showing up in garden centers. It's a cross of two of Minnesota's favorite varieties, Honeycrisp and Zestar, and has that Honeycrisp crunch, but with a sort of fruitier flavor than and sweet tart flavor from Zestar. So you can find more information on it already at the mnhardy.umn.edu website, or scan that QR code that's on the screen there, and that'll take you there. To me, it has a great Honeycrisp crunch, but the flavor is kind of almost a cherry passion fruit when it gets really ripe, and I think that's a lot of the fun of this apple. The other one I'll mention is our previous release, came out about 2-3 years ago, and this is Triumph. And this variety was bred especially for apple scab resistance. And apple scab is our most important fungal disease here in Minnesota. So we crossed Honeycrisp with a variety called Liberty, which is also very resistant to apple scab. And so this one Triumph got the resistances from both parents and has shown excellent resistance to the disease in the field. It ripens in about late September, just after Honeycrisp, has a very crisp texture, but more firm than Honeycrisp. And so this one probably should be available in some of the garden centers, I would guess this spring here as we move into spring now. But let's move on and talk about the origins of our apple breeding program here at the University of Minnesota. And to do that, we kind of need to start with the origin of our domesticated apple. And that goes back to the Tian Shan Mountains of Central Asia, shown here, where the wild species Malus sieversii, Malus is the genus for apple and sieversii is the species. This species, as you can see, dominates certain elevation ranges in the Tian Shan Mountains. This is taken in May during apple bloom, and you can see that probably in this elevation range, 80 to 90% of the trees are apple trees, just as here in Minnesota, you might go to a maple forest and it's mostly maple trees, or an oak forest, it's mostly oak trees. In this part of the world, apple trees are the predominant tree species. So it's a very interesting place. And shown here, it's in the region kind of on what is now the modern border of Kazakhstan and the Xinjiang province or autonomous region in Western China. And of course, this is kind of on what's been called the Silk Road, the trading routes that has been going for probably thousands of years between China and the Middle East and Europe. And so apples, traders passed through this region and probably carried apples, both east and west. We now have some races of very sweet dessert apples that developed in China. And then as they went west, they picked up some genes, Malus sieversii picked up some genes from Malus orientalis, which is in the Caucasus region, and were taken on to Europe, where they picked up some more genes from a native crabapple called Malus sylvestris. And indeed, many of the cider apples of Europe have a lot of Malus sylvestris in them. Apples came to America eventually with early European settlers. So these apples are not native to America, to the North America. We do have about 3 species that are native. They're all very small fruited, what we would call crab apples probably, that are native to North America. But for the large fruited apples, they actually came to us originally from Central Asia by way of Europe, and were carried across the US with settlers from either the Eastern US or Europe. As they moved westward to Minnesota, they eventually made their way to Minnesota with their apples. And they found out that even though they could maybe grow apples very well farther east, our Minnesota's winters presented a really big problem for the apples that they took with them. It was such an important issue that Horace Greeley, who was the publisher of the New York Tribune, apparently when he came in 1860, shortly after Minnesota statehood, wrote, "I would not choose to live in Minnesota because one cannot grow apples there." Now those were kind of fighting words for the early settlers in Minnesota, the early residents of our state. And it encouraged people to try and grow apples. On the right-hand side, you see one of the early successes, which was the wealthy apple, which was developed by Peter Gideon out near Lake Minnetonka. And there were others in Minnesota who demonstrated in the 1860s and early 1870s that it was possible to grow certain apples here. And as it happened, Horace Greeley came back to the Twin Cities for what was called the Great Northwest Exposition. This was kind of a fair of its time, not the Minnesota State Fair, but another exposition. And he said he was apparently impressed with an apple display that was there. And he said, "You have learned to select the hardier kinds of apples better suited for this soil. I rejoice in your success. I will not say that this state will not produce oranges at some future time." Now, we still haven't made it to producing oranges, but we certainly have lots of good apples to eat now. And I don't know, it's going to take a lot of climate change, I think, before we can produce oranges outdoors in Minnesota. So that kind of gave rise to the apple breeding program in Minnesota. There's actually a program of short duration that started in 1878, and it was discontinued about 10 years later. But beginning in 1908, at the current site of the Horticultural Research Center out between Chanhassen and Victoria by what's now the Arboretum, they started the University of Minnesota Fruit Breeding Farm. Now it's called the Horticultural Research Center. And that was thanks to some lobbying by citizens of the state, especially the Minnesota State Horticultural Society members. The legislature appropriated money for purchase of some land there and also for operation of the fruit breeding farm. They hired the first superintendent, who's pictured on the right here, and his name is, that many of you will recognize, is Charles Haralson. And he was the first apple breeder in the program at its current site. And you can see, believe it or not, David and I do not wear a suit when we are breeding apples, but apparently back in the day, that was how they did things. So he's making crosses of apples indoors at the fruit breeding farm back then. So our history goes back 115 years of continuous apple breeding now at the University of Minnesota. And over that time, we've introduced 29 varieties. And there's been some very unique genetic material that eventually gave rise to some of the great traits that we associate with the Honeycrisp apple. And these include some Russian varieties that were originally brought to the eastern United States, eventually made their way to our region. And then also the Siberian crab apple, Malus baccata, which gave a lot of hardiness and also some of the crispness and juiciness that you get in Honeycrisp apple and some of our more recent introductions even beyond the Honeycrisp. So the tradition started by Haralson of apple breeding continues today. You see a photo there on the right of David Bedford and some of our other staff members making crosses in the springtime. And a very wintry photo, obviously not taken this year, but we still do get some of those winters that can be quite good tests for our apple trees. So it's important here to talk about a little bit about apple varieties before we go into the breeding. And one is to make the point that apple varieties are what we call self-incompatible. They will not produce seeds and fruit from their own pollen from the same variety. So for example, pollen from a Honeycrisp will not successfully fertilize a flower of Honeycrisp, whether it's on the same tree or a different Honeycrisp tree. You need to have it pollinated by another variety. And because of that, because each apple seed resulting from this cross-pollination has two parents, apple trees or apple varieties do not come true to type from seed. That is, you can't plant a seed of a Honeycrisp apple that you take out of a Honeycrisp apple and get another Honeycrisp apple tree. Now, Honeycrisp will be the mother of that little seedling tree, but the father will be somebody else based on the pollen that was brought in for the pollination. So each seed then is genetically unique, and that's a very important thing for our apple breeding especially. Now, the other important feature is that apple trees are what we call asexually propagated. That is, we don't go through seed. And we asexually propagate them or clone them by grafting. And this allows us to make many, many copies of a superior individual. If we find one seedling tree that we really like, and it's maybe going to be the Honeycrisp variety, well, all the millions of Honeycrisp trees that are now out in the world all came from one original tree by way of grafting. And the photo on the right here shows one form of grafting. This is what we call summer budding. And what we see here, this bigger woody part, this is what we call the rootstock. It's going to be the root piece for the eventual mature tree. Now, the fruiting part that we're going to have is called the scion. And this is what is grafted on top. So we started in this case by making a little slit, kind of a T-shaped slit in the rootstock. And then we insert a bud, let's say of Honeycrisp, if we want to make another Honeycrisp tree. This little bud here from Honeycrisp will eventually start growing next year and produce a new Honeycrisp tree on the rootstock that we've grafted onto. So this is really important in terms of how a new variety gets distributed and eventually grown by the hundreds of thousands or millions in orchards around the country, around the world. So this is what we're kind of aiming for in breeding a new variety. And this schematic shows the breeding process as we go through the years. It's a long process, starting with crossing in the beginning, year one, growing this very small seedlings that come from the seeds that we take out of the fruit from our crosses. And then there's a seedling testing phase where an individual tree, an unreplicated tree is observed and its fate is decided, whether it's either going to go be discarded or go forward for replicated testing, where we replicate it by cloning. And then we go into a larger sort of pre-commercial phase where we enlist some growers to help us evaluate the fruit. And eventually we hopefully get a cultivar out of it, a cultivar or a cultivated variety. But cultivar is a term that we use in horticulture for varieties of plants. So this is the process. I'll go through each of these steps in some detail. I like to say that apple breeding is it's a dating and mating process that we do as apple breeders. And the dating part is we try to fix up one apple variety with another based on their performance data. And nowadays we use genetic marker data too. So what we're trying to usually do is complement traits. So if we've got one potential parent that is, let's say, really crisp but susceptible to disease, we'll try to cross that with a disease-resistant parent, and hopefully also keep the good fruit quality that we have. So this photo shows us starting in the winter, designing our crosses or doing the dating game for our apples. We move into the spring this time of year, and we'll probably be crossing apples here in just a couple of weeks, or maybe less even. And this is where we do controlled hybridization, where we control the pollen that's being used and we control the mother plant as well. So on the tree that's going to be the mother plant, what we do is before the flowers have opened, we put a kind of a white waxed paper bag over them to keep the insects from cross-pollinating them. We want to be the ones that actually bring the pollen and control the pollination and the hybridization. So it looks something like this. We'll come back when the flowers are open and take that bag off, and we'll also bring the pollen that we want to use. So this is pollen that's been collected from the tree that's going to be the father. You can see kind of this yellow haze. That's actually the pollen. And we'll take our fingers and actually hand pollinate then every flower that was inside all the paper bags that we've got. And that's what you see in this photo of me and one of my former graduate students. And so we'll maybe have 20 to 50 bags of flowers for each cross that we want to do, each combination of parents. And we'll hand pollinate each of those flowers. So it turns out to be tens of thousands of flowers each year. And that produces, of course, the hybrid seeds. In the fall, we'll collect the fruit from this tree, from the bags that where we've pollinated, extract the seeds from the fruit. Each one of those is a unique hybrid. It has the same two parents, but every one of them will have different combination of genes. Those seeds are planted in the greenhouse over the winter, the next winter. And as I mentioned, each seedling is genetically unique. And this is where we will use DNA tests sometimes to select certain seedlings and get rid of others that are likely to be good or bad for a trait that we're interested in. Those seedlings that we choose to keep then go out to a seedling test orchard, which looks like this after about 3 years or so. And in years 3 to 10, we're mostly growing the trees here until the point where they start fruiting. And that usually happens in about years 5 to 8. And at that point, we've got to test them all. Now, as I mentioned, each seedling is genetically unique. So we've got to look at every single one of those trees that we saw in this photo here and look at their fruit. This just is kind of a demonstration of you can cross two parents like this, and this is the range of fruit that you'll get in their offspring. And it's a lot like humans. Some of these kids look a little bit like the parents, but not exactly like the parents. And some of these kids look a little bit alike, but there are no two that are actually identical. So we end up then with a field of about, usually we're carrying about 20 to 25,000 individual seedling trees that we've got to go through each fall, once a week, find the ones that are ripe that week and taste the fruit. We evaluate the fruit for a number of traits, but these are the main ones. Texture is the most important thing we're looking for, good texture. We need some firmness. Probably more importantly, we want crispiness and juiciness. And then we can take some range of sweetness and tartness. As you know, some people like sweeter apples, some people like tartar apples. So there's some range there. And then we're also looking for interesting flavors. And then finally, we want a reasonably good appearance. It's often said that appearance is really important for the first purchase of an apple variety. But really, it's that eating experience that is going to get people coming back. If the eating experience is good, they'll look for it again. So we have to, when we're doing this selection among the seedlings in the seedling orchard, we have to try to figure out which ones are going to perform well. Most of them get thrown away. Only about 1 out of 200 is kept as a potentially really good individual. So those individuals that are selected in seedling testing are propagated by grafting again. So we're cloning. If we select this individual tree here, for example, at the bottom, we're going to make clonal copies of that tree so that we can see how it performs, basically having multiple copies of it. And there's a lot more data that's taken. We have more fruit that we can use here for tasting, for a consumer panel, for testing how it goes over a fruit packing line, some of the things that are needed for commercial orchard production. So there's potentially multiple years of evaluation, and this would be the years typically about 7 to maybe up to 16 years after the cross was made. again, we look at a number of traits during that period. Some of them are tree characteristics. We grow the trees in a more typical commercial situation. Certainly, we're interested in fruit characteristics, eating quality, disease resistance, and then any fruit defects or storage potential problems that show up in storage are where this is where we have enough fruit to be able to look at those various traits. So the next step, hopefully, for we find a good one, is what is going into over on the right-hand side here. We have what we call grower trials or pre-commercialization trials. And again, we graft usually several hundred trees, and we've got a network of reliable commercial orchard testers, kind of ranging from New England out to Washington and including some in Minnesota, who will grow it for a few years and report back to us some of the results of their trial. If we don't hear anything, that's usually a bad sign. If it turns out it really is a good one, usually the phone's ringing or the email's coming through. And if we do get one of those, it appears to be a hit, such as our golden ticket up here. We've got several other steps. We've got to do nursery tree production. It takes about 2 years for a nursery to make a tree by grafting. And then several years, of course, once a commercial grower plants a tree for it to get into production. So that's kind of the life history of our breeding program here. It's usually about, these days, about I would say 15 to 20 years from the crossing of two parents until one of the offspring might become a variety. And then you add maybe another 5 years until the grower's trees become big enough and there's enough fruit to actually go to market, and it's at some scale. And so it's probably about a 25 to maybe even 30-year process to go from the crossing to getting something basically on the shelf in a supermarket. So it's a long development period. So that's basically how we do it. And now I'll talk a little bit about Honeycrisp. That, is certainly our most well-known apple variety from our breeding program. It goes back, here's my colleague David. He was out in the orchard in 1983 and evaluating some of the fruits, and he found this very unusual apple. And he wasn't quite sure what to think of it at first, but he thought it might be good. And I was in the office that day. He brought some back to me, and I said, "Yeah, this is pretty interesting." So we looked it up, and the cross was made actually before David or I were there. We would have been young children at that point in 1960, and it was said in the records that the parents were two varieties, Macone and Honeygold. Macone is a Canadian variety. Honeygold is a variety from our University of Minnesota breeding program that was named in the 1960s. Honeycrisp then was selected as a seedling and got the designation Minnesota 1711. That was kind of its test number. And then eventually got the name Honeycrisp, and it was introduced in 1991 and started to be grown first in Minnesota and then gradually was recognized across the country. It became very popular in Minnesota, and the legislature, at the bidding of some students in an elementary school from Stillwater or Bayport, petitioned the legislature to name it Minnesota State Fruit, which they did in 2006. And so one of the problems, one of the conundrums David and I had was we were never very satisfied with this parentage that was in our records of Macone and Honeygold. This wonderful variety, Honeycrisp, just didn't seem to have the combination of characteristics we might have expected. But this is what we had, was just the recorded records from our predecessors. But as we got into the late 20 teens and DNA markers became very readily available in apple for genetic testing and fingerprinting, I had a graduate student who looked into this more carefully and found that indeed Honeycrisp was not from McCown and Honeygold as its parents. One of the parents was a University of Minnesota variety called Keepsake. The other one was a selection that never got named. It was Minnesota 1627. And we don't actually have that one around anymore. We were able to determine that it was one of the parents by looking at some of its other children along with Honeycrisp, much the same way we do paternity testing for humans, and figure out that this one was indeed the one that would have given rise to Honeycrisp along with Keepsake as the other parent. So this was something we finally were able, a mystery we were able to unravel in 2017. And we were actually able to go even farther in terms of the parentage and figure out who some of the more distant ancestors of Honeycrisp were. And you probably recognize some of these if you know some of the older apples. Northern Spy was a very popular apple in the early to mid 20th century. Duchess of Oldenburg has been grown in Minnesota gardens and orchards for 100 years or so. Golden Delicious certainly is available widely. And it goes back even to a little French apple called Renette Franche, which is kind of the Eve of apples. It's in the ancestry of just about every important commercial apple right now. So it's a very interesting apple itself, and it turns out by way of Grimes Golden and the Duchess of Oldenburg and Golden Delicious and Minnesota 1627, it's also in the ancestry of Honeycrisp too. So Honeycrisp, excuse me, get a little water here. Honeycrisp, we like to say, really changed the apple game. It changed consumer expectations for eating delight and also price. As we go from 1991, when Honeycrisp was introduced, through the 90s, Honeycrisp came along kind of at the right time. Consumers were becoming more interested in exploring diversity in their food. The apple industry was at a low point and was growing, I'll say, too many bad apples. They were looking for new varieties. Honeycrisp, thanks to Minnesotans, became kind of a cult apple in the Twin Cities market in the 1990s. People around the country in the produce business started noticing that consumers loved it, even though it was really high priced, because it was still pretty rare. Not too many of them grown yet. In the 2000s, we had tremendous supply growth. And yet demand was not met, and consumers were still not deterred by the high price. They kept buying them. And I'll just add that this year of 2023-24 from the 2023 crop is the first year we're finally seeing lower prices for Honeycrisp because supply appears to have matched demand this year. It's taken that long for growers to plant enough trees to have them all fruiting. And then we had a confluence of circumstances in 2023 where all the major fruit production regions of the United States, Washington, New York, Michigan, Pennsylvania, all had very large crops of Honeycrisp. So finally this year, we are actually seeing some price moderation and some supply pressures. Let's see, whoops, hang on here. Hit the wrong button. There we go. So yeah, 2000s we're seeing it becoming popular. And this I like this quote. In 2001, Michael Pollan, who wrote The Botany of Desire, back around then, and other books, there's this quote from him. He was recognizing that, hey, this is a pretty interesting apple. He said, if you could buy stock in fruit, I'd definitely buy Honeycrisp. I really think it is the apple of the future. And Honeycrisp went on to become even more and more famous. It's got its own internet memes. Here's one that somebody sent me last year. Honeycrisp lovers watching the peasants eat gala and red delicious. And Honeycrisp by 2023 then, our last crop, had ascended to one of the top 3 apples in terms of production in the United States, about 30 million bushels grown last year. Once we get through the whole marketing season, it may even turn out to be number 2. And those top 6 varieties are listed here on the right-hand side. Gala is number 1. Red Delicious is still number 2. Gala overtook it a couple of years ago. Honeycrisp has moved up to number 3, ahead of Fuji, Granny Smith, and Golden Delicious. Interestingly enough, Honeycrisp is the only variety on this list of the top 6 that came from a breeding program in the United States. So it's the only one from sort of conscious breeding in a United States program to move up to that level so far. But it's also grown around the world in other places. David and I have been to various places where it is grown, certainly across the USA and Canada, in Europe, China, South America, South Africa, New Zealand, and Australia. All these places are growing it to some extent. And I think that's the result of really learning some lessons here that good apples really delight consumers. If you grew up when I did as a child, you know, we had a lot of Red Delicious and Golden Delicious, and some Macintosh that were available, especially in the supermarkets, and not a lot of variety, but we can now get some very good apples of a whole lot of different varieties. And we also learned that consumers will pay for good apples. When Honeycrisp first went to market, retail grocers said, "Oh, we can't charge more than $1.50 a pound for apples." But Honeycrisp proved them wrong in that regard. And for many years, they were very expensive. As I said, finally this year, they're getting somewhat cheaper. Now, Honeycrisp has become a strong consumer brand, not just for apples. It's kind of amazing to me where this brand has gone. And here's a few examples. We got Honeycrisp chicken sausage, Honeycrisp gum, Honeycrisp sangria goat milk soap, Honeycrisp candles, Honeycrisp foaming bath hand soap. And I doubt there's too much Honeycrisp apple in a Honeycrisp candle, but they love the name, they play on the name, and it's become a real consumer brand, even beyond apples themselves. So for the future, I think we can expect that Honeycrisp will persist as an important apple variety in North America and probably other parts of the world too. And it could be for decades too. It's got a very strong brand recognition. Younger generations now, our millennials and Gen Z generations have grown up eating them, and are, at least with my kids and their friends, they're buying them for their kids now. But like nearly all varieties, I think we can expect it will eventually decline. They all come and go eventually. And that's where it's also interesting that probably the most important legacy of Honeycrisp as we go into the future decades probably will be its genetics. Breeders around the world are using it as a parent, and these Honeycrisp children are already being brought to market in the US and in other countries. We mentioned some of them already, Kudos and Triumph, and a couple others that were earlier, SweeTango and Rave First Kiss. But other breeding programs have been using them too. Cornell University has introduced Snapdragon, which you may have seen. Cosmic Crisp comes from Washington State University. And then a number of other varieties, I've just put a few on here that are being introduced, are all children of Honeycrisp that are coming into our markets now. So I think we're going to see Honeycrisp have quite a sustained effect in the apple world, probably for many decades. So I'll leave you with this thought. Why do we need all these new apples? Well, I was talking to a group at the University of Minnesota Dental School a few years ago, and one of the dentists there sent me this little comic, and I'll let you read through it. And I thank you very much for your attention. And Laura, I'll be happy to entertain the questions.
All right, thank you. That was so interesting. I had no idea, and several of the other attendees echo my thoughts here. We are surprised that Red Delicious could ever possibly be higher in sales than Honeycrisp.
Well, we hope to take it down in a year or two, but yeah, it's been #1 for a long time, and
yeah,
it slides down the scale.
Taste and its firmness leave a lot to be desired. Okay, so we have many questions, as you can imagine. I wanted to start with the questions about the patent process for these apples and what the University of Minnesota retains.
Yeah, so these apples that we develop are treated like any other technology at the university, and fall under Regents policies governing the ownership and commercialization. And so when we develop a new apple that we think has commercial potential, we first file what's called a disclosure with the Technology Commercialization Office at the university. They then assist us with obtaining a US plant patent and sometimes protection in other countries as we think about perhaps distributing a new variety internationally. So the university, as inventors, we sign over, just like the invention of anything at the university, we sign over rights, or we assign rights to the regents of the University of Minnesota. Any intellectual property is pursued from there through the Technology Commercialization Office. Also, with apples in recent times, in addition to patenting them, it's been a custom now in recent years to obtain trademarks that are used in the retail sale of those apples. And so, for example, Kudos is now a registered trademark, and that trademark, again, belongs to the Regents of the University of Minnesota, or it's been assigned to them. And those are then the ability to propagate these apples and to use those trademarks those rights are granted to nurseries or growers in various parts of the country or the world by the Technology Commercialization Office. And then any royalties are distributed back according to the Regents' policies.
So as far as you know, the university still gets money from every tree that is out there?
Yeah, so there's a couple different commercialization models. For SweeTango, for example, the university gets some money when a tree is first sold and planted, and then gets money each year based on the crop, a percentage of the crop. For other varieties, such as the new Kudos and Triumph, there's simply an upfront tree royalty. So if you go to a garden center and buy one this spring or next spring, embedded in that price is probably about $1.50 of a royalty that goes back.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So we also have questions about what other universities have apple programs like the university?
Yeah, in the United States, there's really only 3 major apple breeding programs at universities. One is at Washington State, which makes sense. They're the largest apple producing state in the United States. The other is at Cornell University, which is the second largest apple producing state in New York. And then us here at the University of Minnesota. There are a number of private breeding efforts. And then probably our biggest competition is really from breeding programs outside the United States. There's, probably 20 to 30 programs through Europe, Canada, and perhaps even more than that in China. And so the growers around the world that are looking for new varieties are testing not only our new potential varieties, but also potential varieties from these other breeding programs too. So you might say the competition here in the United States is not all that great in terms of number of programs, but really it's a global scene as far as sourcing new apple varieties for apple growers.
Well, what makes our program best?
Well, we like to think that we're best because we have really emphasized the eating experience. And that has not always been the case for other programs. Some of them have emphasized more shippability, storability, sometimes some cases disease resistance. We've really tried to emphasize having great eating experience, and we think that's what would bring apple eaters coming back for our varieties.
And so how do you determine that eating the quality of the apple, because it's so subjective? How do you get that data?
Yeah, in that seedling selection stage that I talked about, we're actually looking at maybe hundreds of trees a day that have their fruit coming ripe on that day. So our crew they'd be eating 300 to 500, or I shouldn't say eating, tasting 300 to 500 fruits per day. Most of those trees produce ordinary to bad fruit. It's pretty easy to throw them away. What we do is we tag what we think are the good ones, and we come back when we've got a fresh palate a couple days later as a group and taste them again. And then the good ones that we continue to think are good are clonally propagated, and that gives us more fruit to let more people taste them. I think one of the things that people always, first people think, oh, tasting apples all day, that must be a great job. No, it's not really. It's a very trying job. And so a lot of it is mental. You've got to, it's not only what's on your taste buds, you've got to be thinking your way through this, because it's a grind to get through tasting and spitting, maybe 300 apples a day. And so you've really got to focus on it. And people say, well, how can you do that? I would say, well, how does an accountant get through looking at a screen all day of numbers of spreadsheets? It's really, it's about focus in our job, just as it is for other people about focus in their jobs. How does a surgeon focus in a 5-hour surgery or something like that? Well, how do they get through that? They're very focused on the job. So that's an important point too.
All right, here's a big question. Does your department host field trips to this farm specific related to the tree breeding and cloning process? Is that available?
Generally not. It's the Horticultural Research Center is part of the Arboretum, but it's part that's not open to the public. We occasionally have some groups that come in. For example, we had the Minnesota Apple Growers Association last year, but it's generally not open to the public, with the exception, I'll say, that the children's education program at the Arboretum has trips for school groups that come out there. But that's where teachers, schools can reserve a field trip time and come out, and the children can learn about growing apples. It's not so much about breeding, but about growing apples. Yeah, but we do have the Apple House out at the Horticultural Research Center
Mhm.
on the corner of Highway 5 and County Road 11, Rolling Acres Road. And that's a popular place where you can try some try some of the Minnesota apples, and we sometimes have some of our numbered selections there for sale. And although we don't let you go back into the orchards and all that, it's a place to experience a little bit of what we do. And then the other thing I'll mention that is the Farm at the Arb, which is a relatively new exhibit area at the Arboretum. That has an area that we've worked with Arboretum staff to develop that has a modern orchard to show kind of what modern day production looks like in a commercial orchard. And also all the varieties, examples of all the varieties of apples that have been introduced from the University of Minnesota. So those 29 varieties. So there are a few places to see some of it, but
So I wanted to talk a little bit more about the genetic part of your presentation. First of all, do you know how many genes apples have?
we're kind of still learning that all the time. It's probably in the neighborhood of around 30,000.
Oh, okay.
Just as we humans have somewhere in that neighborhood too, actually. Although we're learning a little more about
Interesting.
that all the time too.
And have you been able to isolate which gene causes or creates which traits of the apple?
Yeah, for some traits, it's relatively simple. They are controlled by a single gene. Examples of ones that we follow are the our genes for resistance to apple scab, for example. I mentioned that fungal disease. There are a number of single genes that give resistance to races or strains of apple scab. And those we can follow with individual markers. There's a single gene that governs whether an apple will produce fruit with red pigment or not. So, you know, red and yellow fruit versus yellow or green fruit. You can think of it as Honeycrisp versus Golden Delicious or Granny Smith. So those are some very simple traits that we can follow. Some of them are a little more complex. I suppose 15, 20 years ago, I was hoping we would find what are those genes that give the crispness of Honeycrisp. Maybe well, we kind of knew it wasn't a single gene because we weren't finding children with that crispness in really high proportions. And so it turns out it's probably at least 4 or 5 different genes that came together in Honeycrisp and give us that amazing texture that it's got, that crispness and juiciness.
So did I hear you right that every single individual tree that's currently producing Honeycrisp apples has been grafted? Am I saying that right?
That's right. Yes. They've all been cloned by grafting from an original tree that was grown from a seed. Back in the 1960s, actually started from a seed then. And when we found it in 1983, then we cloned it by grafting, and basically all the trees that are out there now came from an original single tree, and that's how it's done for all the different apple varieties. If we go to Golden Delicious, for example, that was a tree that was found in a fence row in West Virginia. Just from a seedling that came up. All the Golden Delicious in the world, and that's probably one of the most widely grown apples in the world, go right back to that tree in terms of their origin. They've been grafted from that tree or from grafts from that tree. That's how we get the identical trees.
So over time, do the qualities degrade?
The qualities can be different over time. One of the very common things that happens is growers, of course, because they're harvesting fruit, they notice that maybe a limb on a certain tree has redder fruit. And that can happen because of a mutation that occurs. We get mutations occurring occasionally.
Yeah.
And actually that redder fruit is desired in the marketplace by retailers for their displays. One of the things we've seen, with Red Delicious, for example, that's been around for over 100 years. The Red Delicious we're looking at in a supermarket today are nothing like the Red Delicious that was found on a farm down in southwest Iowa originally. It was kind of a speckly red and yellow apple. It was not that deep crimson thing that we see now. But through several cycles of selecting these mutations, and then mutations of mutations, and mutations of mutations of mutations, we've gotten these apples with very red skin. The skin is thicker, and some people would say they don't have the flavor that the original Red Delicious, which is called Hawkeye, actually had back decades ago. So that does happen. What we're seeing now is sort of that first generation of mutations of Honeycrisp have been found. Mutations happen. They happen all the time, just as they happen in us humans. And, sometimes it's results in cancer or something like that for us, but they happen all the time. And some of the newer versions of Honeycrisp that are being planted, say out in Washington, are the result of mutations that growers have found.
So at what point can growers still use the label Honeycrisp?
Well, that's an interesting question. Yeah, they certainly, over time, for example, have used Red Delicious for this whole series of mutations. And usually we can't even find the mutation with our standard fingerprinting techniques, DNA fingerprinting techniques. So these things are, a Honeycrisp sport, as we call them, is Honeycrisp as far as we can tell for the most part at the genetic level. There's very, very specific genetic changes or epigenetic change. I don't know how much of the genetics lesson we want to get into here, but that can cause things like changes in fruit color.
So at what point can they stop? Do they have to, is there
there's really no
surveillance?
Yeah, there's really no legal thing about that I'm aware of. If you were to, the surveillance would be, kind of like they've done with fish. You go in and take samples, and you can tell the difference if something, is supposed to be cod and it's some other kind of fish. We can tell the difference between varieties. We can't necessarily tell the difference, though, between these sports of these varieties and the original. And because the appearance can change so much, and also the eating quality can change so much, depending on environmental factors like temperature, age of the tree, things like that. A Honeycrisp grown in one place does not necessarily look like a Honeycrisp grown in another place too, just because of those environmental factors or management factors.
I imagine that could eventually lead to a lot of litigation
It
from
could.
you and the royalty stream, and what is a Honeycrisp and what is not. And yeah, it's a lawyer's dream. Okay. You mentioned the age of the tree. How long do apple trees last?
Well, apple trees with good care can last many decades. We see, well, and it depends on the environment again. You see in northern Minnesota, they don't last as long as they do in the Twin Cities, where they don't last as long as they do, let's say, in a milder place like Western New York. But even, here in the Twin Cities, it's a 50-year-old tree is not that unusual if people take good care of it. So they can be very long-lived tree species.
I'm sorry. Are there all of these older apples that are no longer marketed, are there repositories or genetic data banks for these?
Yeah, there are several. The USDA operates a genetic repository in Geneva, New York, that has 5,000 to 6,000 different ones. And then there's been quite a movement in various parts of the country to gather up, I'll say, old apple trees that are on the landscape. Some of them may have been varieties, and some of them may be just seeds that passed through a deer and got planted. But there's some rather well-known ones in Maine, Oregon. Seed Savers Exchange in our neighboring state of Iowa maintains a nice orchard of heirloom apples. And so, yeah, there are several places where people are, either the government or usually not-for-profits are maintaining collections of apples.
Interesting. Okay, so rootstock, the scion at the top, the rootstock at the bottom, it's another component of this. And is the breeding program also looking into identifying different rootstock options?
We are not here at the University of Minnesota. Most of the new rootstocks in the United States come from a program that's out at New York at Cornell University, and the USDA have a kind of a joint program. And I'm very glad of that, because we don't need to worry about breeding for rootstock traits such as resistance to soil diseases or water use efficiency, or those kind of things. We can just worry about the top of the tree.
Yeah.
So we certainly stay in touch with the breeder, the rootstock breeder there, and what we try to do is test our new scion varieties on some of the the common and upcoming commercial rootstock varieties from that program. So we certainly talk to each other and communicate about what we've got going. And then he will test some of, for example, he's been using Honeycrisp to test some of his rootstock selections in his breeding program as candidates for possible commercialization.
So moving along to the topic of pesticides, I'm assuming you don't use any on your sample growing fields?
Well, we do use some, yeah. What we try to do is use a minimal pesticide program, because we want to see resistance if we can, if it exists. So we want a disease, let's say, to develop in our seedling populations, but we don't want it to become an epidemic where we can't get any useful data. We're basically, all the fruit is ruined, so you can't even taste any fruit. So we sort of try to create a controlled epidemic, if you will, where we get the disease present, but not at a level that it totally interferes with our selection ability. We had a situation a few years ago, for example, where a bacterial disease called fire blight kind of got out of hand, and it destroyed about half of our seedlings. This a couple of decades ago. So it was good in the sense that we found some that were resistant, but that was an unusual situation. We generally don't see that kind of a fire blight pandemic very often in Minnesota. So that's something we want to avoid if we can.
So how does climate change affect your work? And are you breeding specifically for the future 50 years?
Yeah. Well, one thing I like to say is we've been breeding for climate change all along. And because our climate has been changing and we've been selecting in our climate. So I first noticed it in a big way, probably about the year 2000, that in our Minnesota climate, compared to my first 20 years, the 1990s, 1980s, around the year 2000, it was really noticeable that our winter temperatures we're not, the nighttime lows, we're not going as low anymore. We weren't getting the minus here in the Twin Cities, the minus 25, minus 30 very often anymore. Our falls or autumns were going much later. We had mild temperatures. In the 1980s, we would kind of think we'd have a killing frost about middle of October. Now we routinely go to the end of October, early November, even some years. In the spring, we've tended to have wetter, cooler springs. In most of the time, I mean, obviously this spring we'll see how it turns out. It's good that it's finally getting a little wetter after the drought we've had the last couple of years. But wetter, cooler springs especially mean that we get more apple scab, some of the diseases that need water to infect the tree. Now, that's Minnesota, but climate change has different effects in different parts of the country or different parts of the world. In South Africa, the effect is they don't get the cool temperatures in the winter that allow the trees to bloom in the spring. I mean, we don't have that problem yet. Hopefully won't for a while. In Washington, we're getting higher summer temperatures during the daytime, which we're not really getting here. We're getting higher nighttime temperatures here, but we're getting higher daytime temperatures there. And that's leading to more sunburn issues or heat damage issues. In the eastern part of in the more humid eastern part of the United States, what we're seeing is diseases that used to be common more in the mid-Atlantic, southeastern part of the United States are moving up to production regions like New York because we've got the warm, humid conditions moving farther north. So, you know, breeding for climate change depends on where you're breeding for. And since many parts of the world will be touched in different ways, you know, you got to kind of be thinking about these. You've got to test in those parts of the world eventually, and be aware of what some of the changes are, and that they might not be the same as what's going on here in Minnesota.
Can Honeycrisp actually be grown anywhere in the country, or is that really limited to the colder climes?
It does best in the cooler climates.
Okay.
I would say some of the best Honeycrisp I've had, in addition to Minnesota, are probably from the Champlain Valley in Vermont and New York. From some of the cooler, higher elevation areas of Washington. Where it really struggles is as you get to the mid-Atlantic states. And although I've had people tell me they can grow in Texas, I don't think it's really very well adapted to, you know, really that southern tier of states. And when you go out west, it really needs to have some elevation to get to a cooler climate where it will tend to ripen the fruit well. It seems to need sort of cool temperatures to really ripen the fruit well, get that good texture, that good flavor. It seems to need cool temperatures during the ripening period.
Okay. So I've got several questions about you specifically and the university's program. So I'll start with you. How did you wind up in this profession?
Well, excuse me. I always liked biology in high school, for example. In all the they didn't teach much genetics, but the little bit of genetics that they taught at the high school level, I found pretty interesting. I worked on my uncle's dairy farm in the summers, baling hay, milking cows, that kind of thing. And that's kind of where I got my interest in agriculture. And so I started out actually at the University of Wisconsin as a freshman, looking for a campus job. And I happened to land my first job as just an undergraduate research assistant for an oats breeder. And I saw what a plant breeder did. I thought, hey, this is pretty cool. You get to use genetics, you produce a useful product. During the nice part of the year, you're outside evaluating plants. So that was all very appealing. I went on to actually get my undergraduate degree from Purdue University. And while there, I worked for a commercial wheat breeding operation, and then came to the University of Minnesota for my graduate work, and again worked for an oats breeder here, or got my degree in oats breeding here. By that time, I actually had been working with cereal crops quite a while. I became very allergic to the grain dust. And as I was looking for jobs, I thought, I really should get into some crop that is probably better for my health. I also had a girlfriend who became my wife, and we were looking for two jobs. And so, although I interviewed for, vegetable breeding jobs and jobs with other crops, this one turned out to work well. And we lived here in Minnesota then for the last 40-some years.
Wow, that's a great story. So since it takes these apples so long to come to market, basically, how do you keep stoking the pipeline at the U with researchers, and how do you keep people's interest maintained when it takes so long to produce the final product?
Yeah, well, you use the word pipeline, and that's really important. Our predecessors stoked the pipeline, as you said. We stoke it every year, so we're making those crosses every year. Yeah, we won't see the offspring have fruit for several more years, but this year we're going to see the offspring from crosses we made. What is it, 2024? Crosses we made maybe about 2018 will start to have fruit. And so all those stages are happening at once. The pipeline is always flowing in terms of the apple trees. For the people, I've been very fortunate. David Bedford's been here for over 40 years. He and I have been longtime collaborators. Over that time, we've had a whole series of grad students. Now, they're not supposed to be here 40 years, of course, but they spend there 4 or 5 years and make contributions to the project. We've had 2 or 3 really long-term orchard managers, and we couldn't do this without good orchard management on the part of our staff. So that's been really important too. So people have mostly liked it as a place to work. The students have gone out, had success in their careers. So it's been, I think, because of we've become known, and so we can attract good students as well. So all of that has contributed to the pipeline.
Are there other programs at the U that are creating new fruit or vegetable crops? I mean, I know about Kernza for the wheat, but are there other fruit and vegetable development?
In the horticultural realm, we've got breeding. We don't have breeding programs in vegetables anymore. We did back until about the mid-1990s. In fruit crops, we've got a grape breeding program that is creating table grapes and wine grapes, and has really given birth to the all the local winery industry that we've got throughout Minnesota and really throughout the colder parts of the country. So that's the other fruit program besides ours. We've got a program breeding woody shrubs and trees, landscape plants, if you will. Probably the best known thing from that program is all the azaleas we'll see blooming here in 3-4 weeks, probably. We've got a program breeding flower crops, floriculture crops, and turf grass, low input turf grass crops. We've got a cannabis breeding program for hemp. So yeah, there's several different programs in the horticultural realm. And then of course we've got in the field crops or the agronomic realm, we've got some of the more traditional crops, wheat, barley, oats, and then some of these newer crops, as you mentioned, Kernza, and some of the other ones that are being developed through the Forever Green Initiative.
What an amazing university we have. Wow.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, I gotta give credit to our administrators too for supporting plant breeding through the decades. It's, as you saw in my presentation, it's an endeavor that takes a lot of time to get return on the investment. And we've had some patient administrators, but then some who believed in us. So that's been good too.
Okay, so one of our guests says, imagine you always have an abundance of apples from all of this testing. What happens to all of these apples? Do they get sold or donated?
Some of the apples, excuse me, some of the apples that we have get sold through the Apple House at the Hort Research Center. Some of them go into our in the breeding program. A lot of them that we are picking go into the long-term storage. I apologize, it's tornado test day. I don't know if you can hear that, but
I'm glad it's other places besides.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, it's certainly come into my office here. Um, uh, the ones in the breeding program, a lot of them go into our long-term storage testing, where we evaluate them every couple of weeks. We pull some out and taste them, and keep a lot of them until they rot. We want to see how long they will actually store. At some point, a lot of them do actually break down and rot too. So that's where a lot of them go. Some of them grow on the ground, in the orchard, where they enable biodiversity in our orchards. They become homes for insects. They become food for mammals and birds. They keep our wild turkey flock healthy. So yeah, there's a lot of different fates depending on which apple we're talking about.
So you mentioned storage. Is that one of the criteria that you consider when you're developing an apple?
Yeah, definitely. It's a very important one. Apples get harvested once a year in the fall, right? But yet we want to eat them for several months. And we want them to be in a good condition, hopefully something like when they're harvested. So yeah, we will harvest them. We'll take them at maybe 2 or 3 different harvest dates. So there are different stages of maturity, and we can test which stage of maturity of the fruit does the best in storage. And then those go into refrigerated storage. And as I say, we pull them out every couple of weeks and taste them. And then we can determine, what their trajectory is in storage. Is it pretty bad, or is it, not quite so bad? Or is it good, or is it maybe not quite so bad as far as their deterioration in storage? An apple is, once it goes off the tree, it's a senescing organism basically, and so you want something that senesces kind of slowly and still delivers the kind of quality that it had when it first came off the tree.
So if something senesces quickly, would that be a bar to marketing it, or could you still market it but say, eat it now?
Yeah. I mentioned the Zestar apple, for example. That doesn't store really well for more than about, I would say, a month or so. But yet, if you get it in that month, it's really good. And it's also a great cooking apple. Makes great sauce, great baked products. And so, it can be used in that way too. A lot of our early ripening apples in the season, if they're coming off the tree in, say, late August, tend to soften quickly. There's kind of that correlation or relationship with ripening time and how quickly they soften. And so those apples, there's still a place for them because they kind of introduce the season. And then we get into apples that excuse me, and then we get into apples that store longer as we get into the season. In the old days, they used to call them summer apples and winter apples. And the winter apples are ones you could put away in the barrel, pull them out at the starving time, like March and April, when you didn't have much else to eat.
I didn't know that. Okay, how do you come up with the name for an apple?
Oh, that's almost more difficult than reading the apple. So when let's say you have a child, You've got to choose a name for a child. It's okay if that name is not unique. You know, there can be 3 or 4 Michaels or Mohammeds in a classroom, and you know, they each get a different name, Mohammed A, Mohammed M, you know, whatever. They all get recognized. But in the apple world, every new variety has to have a unique name that has not been used before. So apples nowadays tend to have 2 names. They have one name that is used on the patent, which is kind of the legal designation for it. And then there's a trademark usually that's developed as a brand. And so the name on the patent is very simple. We just use MN and then some number, which is usually a shorthand number of the shorthand name for its testing number. So for example, Kudos is MN33, which is kind of short for MN 2033, which was its test number. Kudos is the name, the brand name that consumers will come to recognize, because you know, that's the one that nurseries will use. That's the one that growers will use as they sell the fruit. And so that name, actually, we trademark, and that's the one that's got to be unique. We also like to use names that are phonetic, where they're not confusing to spell or say. We like shorter names generally, no more than three syllables, so that they can roll off the tongue quickly. And then also you've got to remember that, you know, on the packaging or the little stickers that are used sometimes in selling apples, there's not a whole lot of real estate there. So shorter names can be valuable there as well.
Huh.
So by the time you get all the, and you ideally want a name that if you start to go international with it, doesn't translate into something bad in another language. You know, you got all these criteria. And then on top of that, if we're going to get a trademark, we've got to go through getting it registered at the US Patent and Trademark Office. And so it's got to be something that doesn't come up in a trademark search for a similar kind of product or item. So the process is, and we usually come up with a list of names. And in the past, we've solicited names from the university community sometimes. We try to narrow that down to maybe 10 to 20 initially, that we like, that fit those criteria. The other one I should mention is that the name should have good connotations. Okay. You know, Kudos kind of has good connotations. You want something that has projects a positive image too. You get a short list of, let's say, 10 to 20 names. You go through a preliminary trademark search, you know, take the ones that kind of pass that or pass a Google search even. And then those get actually sent, a short list of maybe 5 names get sent to attorneys that the university retains. And they do a thorough trademark search, and they come back with a legal opinion on your candidates. And then if we're lucky, one of them survives.
Wow.
So it's quite a process actually. And to get a good name that meets all those criteria and have it not be used by somebody else, there's just an awful lot of trademarks out there.
At what point in the process does an apple need a name?
I would say it doesn't really need a name until you want something that the consumer will remember. We just give them, you know, in our program, all of our selections get these test numbers. So I think we're up to Minnesota 2240 or something right now. But consumers might confuse that with Minnesota 1914 or 1940, or, you know, the numbers are not, you know, don't stick with you quite the way they stick with us, because we work with them every day. But for consumers, they're probably not going to be as recognizable at the supermarket stage or at the orchard stage if you're going out the orchard.
Do you still consider last names like Wheatley or Haralson or no?
Generally not for the trademark names.
Yeah.
We about what was it, 15 years ago or so, we did use a last name for the legal name. We used the last name of Professor David Wildung, who was a longtime horticulturist here at the North Central Research and Outreach Center. There are issues with using the names of live people, living people. You want to, of course, get their permission. And you want it to be something that will be successful, so they can be proud of it. And as we see with university buildings, there are problems with using the names of deceased people. So using the names of people is, it's fraught with complications, I would say. It's one reason we don't do it anymore. I hope Charles Haralson was basically a pretty decent person. I haven't heard anything otherwise, but that's what the first apple was named after.
So no Luby apples, huh?
No, thank you. No.
No. Okay, well, it's a short name. It would fit on a sticker.
Yeah, I would fit on a sticker. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Technical question here. Will Triumph and Kudos be biennial in bearing?
We have not seen that so far in our testing. No.
Okay. Why someone has asked, why is it harder to find Cortlands and Connell reds? I'm guessing maybe they've pushed out by newer varieties. I don't know how up you are on all the apples that are out there in the marketplace today, but
Yeah, Portland and Connell red. Connell red used to be, or it's a version, it's a red sport, as I described earlier, of a variety called Fireside that came from Minnesota, from the University of Minnesota Breeding Program. So we used to see Fireside and Connell red, the red version of Fireside. Very commonly, even back in the 80s when I started, it was the #2 variety in the state after Haralson. And Cortland has also been was a very common variety at that time too. It's still one of my favorites. You get a good ripe Cortland, it tastes like Riesling wine or something. It's really got quite a nice flavor. And we've seen them probably go. Cortland is very susceptible to apple scab, which is one reason it's become less, it's more problematic for growers, takes more spraying and that kind of thing. So that's one reason it's become less popular with the growers. If Connell red just seems to, it's kind of been displaced as we've had some of these newer varieties come, and you can still find it, but it's becoming harder and harder to find. And usually you've got to go out to, you don't see it in the supermarkets much anymore at all. You've got to go to one of our area orchards to find it.
So along those lines, is the apple house open all year round or just in the fall?
No, it's open usually from, kind of depends on the apple ripening season, but I'll say usually from about the 3rd or 4th week of August until December, or into early December usually.
Okay, so a good fall destination for sure.
Yeah, it's a very popular fall destination. Yep.
Yeah, and you could sample the apples there maybe. Yeah. Okay, well, I think you've done an outstanding job with all these questions I've been throwing at you for 45 minutes. Thank you so much. We are out of time, but what a wonderful presentation. Truly educational, fun, just interesting. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
And thank you to all of our guests and our attendees for all their questions. Please join us next week at the same time on April 18th for our presentation called Diabetes, Obesity, and the Next Generation Drugs Shaping Our Future with Dr. David Bernlohr and Dr. Lisa Chow. Look forward to seeing all of you then. Thank you and goodbye.